Hi, good evening, everyone. Ramadan Kareem, and thank you for joining us this evening. Tonight, we're launching our Al-Shabaka. Al-Shabaka, for those of you who don't know, is the Palestine network. We're an independent, non-partisan, and non-profit organization. And our mission is to educate and foster public debate on Palestine, on Palestinian human rights and self-determination within the framework of international law. Now, if you just bear with me, we're supposed to have two of us on here, and sometimes, as I'm sure you're all aware, internet is not 100% here in Palestine, but I'll just continue until Diana comes back online. So at Al-Shabaka, we produce policy briefs, commentaries, and we hold roundtables and briefings. And we also take part in a variety of panels at conferences. Our members are frequently in the media, putting across that much needed strong Palestinian voice. Now, my name is Yara Hawari, and I am the Palestine Policy Fellow here at Al-Shabaka. My academic background is a PhD in Middle East politics, and I've worked in a variety of civil society institutions and research institutions. Now, we ran a test policy lab a while back, and now we're up and launching the series. Hi, Diana.
Hey, hi, thanks.
I was just doing the introduction. So I was just saying that we ran a policy lab test run a while back, and the point of this space is sort of online live stream discursive space where audiences can engage directly with expert analysis from our over 200 member network. And within these spaces, we hope to craft policies and offer suggestions and strategies related to Palestine, because we feel that too often these discussions are being held without Palestinians in the room and without input from Palestinians. So the general idea of the Policy Lab is to challenge this pattern of Palestinian censorship and to highlight the voices of Palestinian experts. And it's important that we do this as well via an online platform in a hope sort of to break or to transcend the geographic barriers that have been enforced upon the Palestinian people. Now, you can support this project online, and there's a donate function on this Crowdcast. You can also find a donate page on our website as well. And many of you are watching via the Crowdcast and also via the Facebook live stream. Please send in your questions, because after we sort of do our little presentations, we'll be answering those questions. And I hope that we can get as many of them answered as possible. Diana, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thank you, Yara. Yes, my name is Diana Buttu. I'm coming from Haifa at the moment. I'm a lawyer and an instructor, and I practice international human rights law.
Great, thank you. So I'm sure all of you have seen the blurb about this policy lab, but today we're going to be talking about apartheid, and we're going to be looking in particular at Israel's regime of domination and the Palestinian quest for liberation through this specific lens of apartheid. And we're going to look at how apartheid manifests itself on all the different fragments of the Palestinian population, and discuss the overall effectiveness of utilizing the apartheid framework to analyze the Palestinian struggle. So perhaps I'll just begin with talking about apartheid in a very general sense. What does it mean, and how does it manifest itself? Apartheid is an Afrikaans word, the language of the white settlers in South Africa, and it literally means separateness. And it's most famously recognized because of its namesake from its implementation in South Africa. But it now refers to the type of system of institutionalized racial segregation and discrimination. Coincidentally, in South Africa, it was institutionalized by a system of legislation in 1948, the same year that Israel was established on top of Palestine. It was an oppressive and authoritarian manifestation of white supremacy, which saw the minority white settler population dominate the indigenous Black South African population. Now, we have to be very careful when we talk about apartheid that we don't limit our discussion to the South African example, because whilst we can draw upon the South African example for many insights, it's not the defining example. And by this, I mean that a state can be deemed apartheid without following exactly the apartheid model which was implemented in South Africa. The manifestations of apartheid itself can be separated into two categories: petty apartheid and grand apartheid. Now, petty apartheid, is, as one might assume, refers to the much more visible or aesthetic manifestations of apartheid. So, for example, the separation of public facilities, of public transport, of social events, etc. Whereas grand apartheid refers to the sort of the larger structures or policies, such as land use or job opportunities. I think perhaps now we can turn to Diana to talk about what the crime of apartheid means legally speaking.
Thanks, Yara. I think it's important to just dovetail onto some of the comments that you made earlier when you were describing what apartheid is. The crime of apartheid is a crime that is laid out in a number of international human rights instruments, and isn't specifically confined just to South Africa. If it had been just specifically confined to South Africa, then we would have seen that with the fall of the apartheid regime in South Africa, that we would no longer be seeing these types of instruments coming to the fore. But in fact, we have not only seen them continue, but we saw that apartheid is also now something that is contained and enshrined in the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, meaning that it's something that that can be considered that can be taken to the International Criminal Court. So the crime of apartheid means a whole variety of inhumane acts that are committed in the context of an institutionalized regime of systematic oppression and domination by one racial group over another racial group, and I'm just reading at this point, or groups, and committed with the intention of maintaining that regime. And the reason that it's important to focus and highlight on the crime of apartheid and not just the South African case is because it's important to be able to extrapolate it and not just simply refer to one specific area, one part of history, but to really begin to see the overall picture. And that's what I'm hoping we'll be able to do in this policy lab today.
Yeah, thank you for that sort of very clear legal definition of apartheid. I think it would be useful at this point to sort of think about or look at when the word apartheid started being applied to the Israeli regime. I think the term apartheid in terms of the system imposed in Palestine gained more traction after Oslo, particularly with the division of the West Bank into areas A, B, and C, which of course saw the Bantustanization and ghettoization of the Palestinians. The manifestations of petty apartheid, such as the checkpoints, the settler-only roads, etc., also helped for people to make the link between Israel's regime in the West Bank and apartheid. But I think the understanding of Israel's regime as one that practices apartheid on all the Palestinian people rather than just in the West Bank has developed, and I think it's become more widespread, certainly in the last 15 years or so. And I think this is mainly as a result of the work done by activists. For example, in 2005, we saw Palestine activists in Toronto establish Israeli Apartheid Week. And this was it still is a student-orientated annual event. And it's since grown and it's spread to hundreds of campuses around the world. And then, of course, outside of campuses and student life, we've also seen several developments. In 2011, we saw the Russell Tribunal on Palestine, the third international session, which asked the question whether Israeli practices against the Palestinians constitutes as apartheid. More recently, and something that really, I think, grabbed a lot of attention and headlines in the media was the infamous ESQA report. ESQA, of course, standing for the Economic and Social Council for Western Asia. And this report was compiled by Virginia Tilley and Richard Falk, and it can still be found online, despite the fact that it was pulled. Now, in the report, its conclusion was damning, claiming that Israel, and I quote, has established an apartheid regime that dominates the Palestinian people as a whole. And this means, of course, not only Palestinians in the occupied Palestinian territories, the OPTs is the sort of common term, but those in exile and also within Israel proper. And as I said, the report was pulled because it was considered so controversial. But the head of ESCWA, the director, actually stepped down because she stood firmly by the conclusions of the report. And it really is an excellent document. And as someone who's taught students before at university, I think it's a brilliant teaching tool, very clear and simple. So I think that's sort of like a good sort of overview of like the development of the term apartheid in terms of the Palestine-Israel sense. Something that perhaps we can touch upon here, and what ESCWA talks about quite a lot, is how apartheid is inflicted in all the different domains or fragments of Palestinians. And I think that's something really useful, because it can be quite difficult for people to understand how apartheid exists beyond the West Bank and Gaza. Now, the different fragments, of course, are the Palestinians living under military law in the West Bank and Gaza, the Palestinian citizens of Israel, the Palestinians in East Jerusalem under the permanent residency status, and then the millions of Palestinians in exile who are prevented from returning to their rightful and original homes. And I'm just going to briefly outline how apartheid manifests itself in each of these different domains, and perhaps we can go a bit further into this in the question time. Now, Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza are governed by Israeli military law, where they live under conditions of what a lot in the international community call belligerent military occupation, and in Gaza it's a crippling siege. In the West Bank, Jewish Israeli settlers are governed by a civil law. So this creates a dual legal system for two different types of people. And within the West Bank, land is appropriated by the state and is declared state land, meaning land only for Jewish Israeli settlers. Palestinians in East Jerusalem, who are about 300,000 in number, even more now, experience discrimination in terms of services, lands, and this is due to the very fact that they're not Jewish Israelis, and they're given this watered down version of citizenship, which is this permanent residency status, which places them in this constant precarious situation of having to prove their center of life as Jerusalem. And this residency can be taken away from them very easily, and they have no say in the national political system. Now, the Palestinian citizens of Israel, and this is often the sort of the argument that Israel or pro-Zionists will use, or Zionists will use, they use the Palestinian citizens of Israel as an example how Israel is a democracy and certainly not an apartheid regime. The ESCWA report and many other analysts actually use Palestinian citizens of Israel as one of the prime examples of why it is an apartheid regime. And this is down to the very fact of their citizenship. So their citizenship is used as a way to exclude them, to create these different categories of people. So in Israel, unlike most countries, citizenship and nationality are distinct terms and categories. So there is such a thing as Israeli citizenship, there isn't such a thing as Israeli nationality. And in this way, they can create two different categories of people, Jews and non-Jews. And because the state itself describes itself as constitutionally Jewish, those with Jewish nationality trump the ones with non-Jewish nationality. And this plays out obviously in inferior services, restrictions on where Palestinians can live, planning restrictions in the professional sphere. And this all results in a very segregated economic, political, and social landscape. And the Palestinian refugees, who are the final fragmentation of the Palestinians, they live in involuntary exile all around the world, and they're forbidden from returning to their original homes because they're considered a demographic threat. This refusal of the right to return home is very crucial to the apartheid regime and their maintenance of Palestinian demography, right? It's about population control. If Palestinians were granted the right to return home, a right which is enshrined by international law, then this would end the Jewish Israeli majority. Now, the specific treatment, all of these different fragments of the Palestinian population, which are very quickly overviewed, are all integral to the overall system of oppression and apartheid. And I think one of the most striking aesthetic manifestations of apartheid, from the river to the sea, and those of you who visited Palestine will also be able to recognize this, is that the geographically segregated nature of the two populations. You know, even in the so-called mixed cities in Israel proper, Palestine 48, Israeli Jews and Palestinians live very separate and unequal lives. So that was just like a very quick overview of how the apartheid system manifests itself. Now, perhaps we can sort of move on to like how apartheid and how the apartheid analysis can be used to further the Palestinian struggle for liberation, and looking at both the pros and cons. Deanna, would you like to perhaps start off on this one?
Yeah, I think I'm going to start off first, Yara, by telling a very brief story. So leading up to the use of this framework, because it actually has been discussed, as you mentioned very well, not only just by activists, but also in a lot of literature, whether it was Jimmy Carter or Marwan Abshara or Ben White or Virginia Tilley or others who have very thoroughly discussed the apartheid framework. What's interesting for me is not just the discussion of the apartheid framework, but trying to juxtapose that alongside the existing framework that we're using right now, which is that of occupation. And so I'm going to relate just a very brief story about how the current existing framework of occupation is one that has taken us down a certain path and is only leading us to a certain end, and why it might be more strategic to shift gears and start using a different, and start talking about this in a different framework. So one of the cases that has appeared within the Israeli Supreme Court system, and this isn't to legitimate the Supreme Court in any way, shape, or form, but just to highlight the way that the system works, is a case that involved the theft of not just Palestinian land, but Palestinian resources, and in particular quarries. The case involved the use by Israeli companies of quarries in the West Bank. And a legal challenge was brought before the Israeli court in order to try to say that, look, there are these rules of occupation. One of the rules when it comes to occupation is that you cannot pillage. It's just simply not allowed. It's just something that's not allowed. And the Israeli Supreme Court, in their ruling, took people down a path that we're still down at this current moment. And that path was that under the framework of occupation, there's a great deal of latitude that is given to the occupier. And it's a great deal of latitude that's given to the occupier, not only in the sphere of security, but with prolonged occupation. And the further along that this system of occupation goes along, what the Israeli courts are saying is that the more latitude it is that we have to be giving the occupier, so that rules that are firmly entrenched rules are not rules that we should be holding firm to, because what it's doing instead is that it's binding the hands of the occupier, and in binding the hands of the occupier, it means that that Israel won't be able to build settlements, or that quarries won't be able to use Palestinian land and steal Palestinian land. Now, the reason that movement is very interesting is because, although the Israeli Supreme Court is a court that's obviously doing something in Israel's interest, and it's a settler colonial court that is upholding the interests of this settler regime. At the same time, it's indicating where a lot of diplomatic thinking is on this issue. And as somebody who's been here for quite some time, and I'm sure Yara, you know this as well, that there is not just a great deal of legal latitude that is given to the occupier, but there's a great deal of political latitude given to the occupier as well. And this is why I think that switching the framework instead to talk about apartheid and how this isn't just a question of occupier's law and what the occupier is doing, but positioning it within an apartheid framework may actually better illuminate what the situation is. Keeping in mind that obviously this is a settler colonial situation, which is not just, you can't just sort of copy paste what happened in South Africa to what's going on in Palestine. So one of the pros is that it takes us away from this constant focus of international humanitarian law and the latitude that is afforded to the occupier under international humanitarian law, but is instead putting it in a different framework in which you can see the ways in which not just Israel is behaving, but the entire Oslo framework is feeding into this regime of apartheid. So that's for me one of the pros in the way that I see it, is that moving away from the same framework of occupation can actually open up the space to talk about not just the rights of Palestinians in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip, but to actually see this for its broader political framework, which is that of settler colonialism.
Yeah, and I would just like to pick up on that point as well, because for me, I mean, that's one of the pros as well. I mean, of this analysis, how the fact that it's all encompassing on all fronts, especially when we understand apartheid to affect all the fragments of the Palestinian population. I think that the military occupation discourse really limits our discussion to the West Bank and Gaza and to the struggle of those Palestinians. And this can basically, we can fall into the trap, especially in solidarity circles, of saying that the struggle of Palestinian citizens of Israel and the struggle of the Palestinian refugees is not worth the solidarity. So I think that apartheid analysis really manages to encompass the entirety of the Palestinian experience, but also importantly in terms of the historical discourse, it goes back to 1948 and it stresses that the regime of racial segregation did not begin in 1967, it began in 1948. Unlike what most international or discussions on a sort of international level would have you believe. But perhaps it's, also picking up on your final point about settler colonialism, it's important to stress that apartheid is and can be a tool used by settler colonial regimes to control a population, which is either in a demographic majority or poses a serious demographic threat or problem. And I think, I don't think using the term apartheid does not mean that you can't use other terms. It's not an exclusive term. So we can also talk about, settler colonialism, and we could talk about military occupation, and we can talk about siege. So I don't think all these terms are, exclusive. I think we can use them in our struggle, and particularly as apartheid is a crime under customary international law, and the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. I think this is one avenue among many in which we can sort of pursue liberation. Perhaps now we've got quite a few questions actually, and we have touched upon some of them. The most popular question, because on this crowdcast, our audience are able to vote for what question they want answered. So the most popular one actually, which we've sort of already answered, is from someone called Lauren, and it's she asks, can we talk about settler colonialism without talking about apartheid? Can we talk about apartheid without talking about settler colonialism? And I think, as I've just stated, apartheid is a tool or a mechanism which settler colonial regimes use to eliminate the indigenous people and to keep them separate from the settler population. So I don't think that they are exclusive terms. I think there's a lot of overlap, and that we can talk about both of them without cancelling out either one. Deanna, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I don't. I did want to mention a couple of things very quickly. But as you were talking, you talked a couple of thoughts in my mind. One thing that I think that the utility of using this framework, in terms of using this framework again, is that one of the problems that we have right now in terms of using the international humanitarian law or the occupation framework, and solely using the international humanitarian law or occupation framework, is that we're looking for elements within international humanitarian law of occupation, that we find to be illegal, rather than judging the system overall as being something that's illegal. So the difference being that the crime of apartheid is actually considered to be a crime, versus occupation, which is not illegal, but elements of it are elements that exceed legality. And in that vein, I think that picking up on just that question that was asked, is that it's important to look at it in terms of things that are happening on the ground. Here's two Palestinian towns, both of which are right now facing their complete removal. One of them is Susia, which is in the West Bank, and the second being Hiran, which is not in the West Bank, which is in 48 Palestine. And while the effect of the Israeli policies is the same, which is to wipe these towns off the map, oddly, the regimes that we're looking at them and the way that we're analyzing them is somehow different. And so creating that distinction, it's a distinction that is really without a difference. And so going back to the apartheid framework is something that can help us to at least overcome that, and bring in those elements that, as you've already answered, about settler colonialism.
Yeah, no, I think that's really important, and there is a question about the Green Line, which I'll go to in a little bit, because what the apartheid analysis does do, of course, is blur that Green Line. The Green Line, of course, being the 1967 borders. I'd like to now just address the next most popular question, which is really something that I've been thinking about a lot, and I know I've had this discussion with a lot of friends and colleagues. And this is a question from Hav, and they ask, we continue to discuss apartheid, settler colonialism and the like in an attempt to determine the most useful framework according to which we can best interpret our struggle. But aren't they all borrowed frameworks? So my question is, can borrowed frameworks, and they may vary, better interpret and analyze the Palestinian struggle rather than a unique framework authentically generated and elaborated by the Palestinians, where their struggle is defined and analyzed according to their own terms? Well, I mean, this is something definitely that I think about a lot, especially thinking about the language that I use in my writing and the language that I use in meetings. There's been a sort of, this is a result of many things, but particularly because of the NGOization of Palestine, a lot of the language we use to talk about our struggle is sort of confined within these borders of international law, or sort of terms that are not Palestinian terms. And that is a problem that I think that we do need to overcome as Palestinians. But part of that problem is also looking to Palestinians who have analyzed these phenomena and talked about them, but perhaps haven't, been given the credit for them. Palestinians were writing about settler colonialism a long, long time ago, before Patrick Wolf, who's considered the father of settler colonialism, before Lorenzo Veracini, before Ilan Pape. We have people, Palestinians themselves, talking about what was happening in Palestine as an ongoing structure. Fayez Sayah in 1967 wrote about the settler colonial regime in Palestine, in 1965 rather, wrote about the settler colonial regime in Palestine. So I think there has to be like a balance But we also have to go back and look at stuff that's been written by Palestinians, and that's something that we want to do at Al-Shabaka as well, is sort of promote Palestinian analysis and expertise. Diana, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, there's others as well. There's Arif. There were others who were writing about settler colonialism from as far back as the settlers first started to arrive in Palestine, and it's important to build upon their work. Look, I think that there's some validity to the issue of it being borrowed frameworks. But even though the frameworks may be borrowed, it doesn't mean that they're not relevant. And the borrowed frameworks, I think it was back in about 2002 or 2003 that there were some activists here who were saying that we should start coming up with either an Arabic or a Hebrew term for apartheid so that it would resonate with an Israeli audience, given that the term apartheid was an Afrikaans term, and it didn't really take off so well, because people do understand what apartheid is, or at least they did understand what apartheid is. So although the frameworks are borrowed, apartheid is definitely, it's not an Arabic term, it's not a Hebrew term. It doesn't mean that we can't necessarily use these frameworks to help illuminate and to highlight what is happening here, but with the caveat that Yara and I mentioned at the beginning, which is that apartheid isn't just applicable to South Africa. If it had been just applicable to South Africa, then we would have seen the end of any talk of apartheid. We wouldn't have seen it adopted into the Rome Statute. We would have seen it completely die down. So the frameworks are important, but we also have to add the elements that Israel is that Israel is sort of adding to these frameworks that make them somewhat unique and applicable to us. But as an entry point for understanding, I think that they are very valuable.
Yeah, great. Thanks for that. So there's another question here, and this is from Joe Catron, and it's via Twitter. He asks, Israel is clearly guilty of the crime of apartheid, but it's often extrapolated that the struggle for Palestinian liberation should be an anti-apartheid movement for rights rather than an anti-colonial movement for land. Why does it seem uniquely hard to use the word apartheid descriptively without being applied prescriptively? And at this point, is it possible to disentangle the two functions? So I'll begin. I think the important thing to remember is that with the end of apartheid, when apartheid does fall, that should not be equated with decolonization. I think whilst we struggle for an end to an apartheid, we must be very aware that our struggle does not end when the apartheid regime ends. And I think it's a stepping stone. Sort of fighting against apartheid is a stepping stone in the right direction towards decolonization. And I think the sort of anti-colonial, decolonial struggle movement is sort of the umbrella movement in which we're, sort of resisting under. And then one of those sort of aspects, or one of the things that we're fighting against, is apartheid. So, and Diana, you might disagree with me on this, but I sort of think that apartheid would fall under the sort of umbrella of this decolonial struggle or anti-colonial struggle.
I think it's a really great and a very important question, and and I don't have an answer to it, except to say that the reason I don't have an answer is because we're not there yet. We're still at the phase now where even talk of what the outcome should be, if we understand what the struggle is and what the outcome should be, is something that is it's definitely not complicated, but it's at this point there's not really a whole lot of unanimity on it, which isn't to say that we won't get there, but at this point in time, we're not there. So can we separate out the impact of apartheid or the anti-apartheid struggle from that of the settler colonialism? I think we can, in terms of what the goals are. And I agree with Yara that for people who are pushing for to have any sort of resolution coming out of these frameworks, that there's a lot of push that isn't just, let's just follow along the same path that South Africa went down and have it one person, one vote, but Palestinians are talking about actually taking it much further than that, that it isn't just a question of one person, one vote, but it is about decolonization. I think that also, though, one of the, where we're at right now is that the use of BDS as a tool, which was a tool that was used within the apartheid context, is a tool that is very useful for us now. But we have to recognize that it itself is a tool. It's not the end result, and the end result is going to be obviously something very different. So can we separate them out? Absolutely. Are we there yet? I don't think so.
Yeah, great. Now, Chris asks, how useful is the apartheid framework if it is not within a legal framework, with the ultimate goal of being Israel ICC? Does it just become hollow without this follow through?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the question. It cut out.
Diana, what do you think? No, let me read that again. The question, and now I've lost the question. It was about if Israel is not tied to the ICC, it's not signed up to it. Does pursuing this apartheid analysis, is it hollow?
Oh, no,
if it's
not at all.
Used within a legal framework.
Because even though Israel's not hasn't signed up to the International Criminal Court and isn't clearly doesn't want to go down that path, there are others who have signed up for the International Criminal Court, one being Palestine, and other states as well. But even beyond that, there are enough countries that have signed up to the various the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, that it can be said that the crime of apartheid isn't just a crime, a regular crime, but it's a kind of I'm trying to take it out of legal framework, but a supra crime, which means that all nations around the world are obligated to ensure that it isn't being perpetrated, just in the same way of other international customary laws, genocide being one of them, for example. So I think that the legal framework is important, but it's not the only tool that we have out there. And I think that one of the best elements that has come out of using this framework is to try to push for greater BDS and to try to get people to recognize that there was apartheid in one context and BDS was the answer. And there's apartheid. Israel is a state that practices apartheid. And also one of the tools is to be using BDS.
Yeah, great. And just perhaps to follow up on that, Mary is asking a question. She says, so do you think we should consider working towards another advisory ICJ opinion, specifically on apartheid? Or go
both
straight
good questions.
To
it's
ICC?
hard to say at this point in time, given the current makeup of the court, and given the fact that the ICC has been pretty much dragging its feet now for quite some time when it comes to preliminary examinations on not just on Palestine but on other issues and other cases that are before it. So it's hard to say at this point in time. I know that there is some work that's being done to study whether the time is ripe to be doing this. I just don't know at this point in time whether it is ripe, given the composition of the court and given this sort of seemingly reluctance on the part of the prosecutor to move ahead when it comes to issues relating to Palestine.
Yeah, great. Perhaps now I want to return to that question about the Green Line. So this is a question from Amjad. Amjad asks, although the Green Line offers important international tools for Palestinians, it is also an illusionary device used by Israel in fragmenting the Palestinians and hiding its ground apartheid, as we've described. How should Palestinians address this double-edged nature of the Green Line? Is the line too problematic for articulating?
I'll let you answer that
apartheid?
first. Go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, no, this is something that is another thing that I struggle with. Obviously, the Green Line is a line that was imposed on Palestinians and something that the international community claims to be so wedded to. Although we're seeing that very, very quickly sort of unravel before our eyes. Especially last week with the US Embassy opening in Jerusalem on occupied land. I think in terms of usefulness, and I've said this before to international partners and colleagues, I think if the international community wants to remain wedded to that Green Line, we have to hold them accountable to it. So for example, we have to make sure that they're not funding projects or not taking part in projects that are within sort of occupied or what the international community defines as occupied territory. So I think there's small gains that can be made using these sort of international tools. But in the wider scheme of things, Amjad is correct. The Green Line is just a way to fragment the Palestinian population. It's also a way to sort of divide up Palestinian land, but it's so difficult because Palestinian society and civil society has been so dominated by the international donor community that much of our work has to, sort of held hostage to this, has to sort of fall within these borders that are imposed on us and these sort of political terminologies that are imposed on us. So it's a very fine line that Palestinians sort of have to work on, sort of rejecting the fragmentation, but also, working within the limits of what the international community has set for us.
It's interesting reflecting on the Green Line, because the Green Line really means nothing, and by nothing, it's to say that it's a fig leaf that allows Israel to have its focus be on the West Bank and on the Gaza Strip, and somehow erase everything that it's doing inside 48 Palestine, and so that all of the attention is focused on the West Bank and Gaza Strip, somehow legitimating all of the racism, the discrimination, the apartheid that's going on inside Israel against Palestinians who are citizens of the state. But the other thing that the reason that it's a bit of a myth is because even the donors themselves and the international community themselves aren't really wedded to the Green Line. And by what I mean by that is that they're more wedded to whatever power is pushing forward and not necessarily the Green Line. By this, for example, I say, let's look at East Jerusalem. You can, I don't mean to be facetious, but you can really look at some of the statements that have come out from the donors as far back as the 90s and juxtapose them with statements that are coming out in 2016, 2017, 2018. And you can just see that it's like they cut out the number and changed the number of settlers, and it's the same formulation. We want East Jerusalem as our capital. But at the same time, while they say that they believe in the Green Line, there's very little that is actually done to make sure that the Green Line is, in fact, a Green Line. So their efforts instead are not so much on the Green Line and the actions that Israel is doing on the other side of the Green Line, but mostly on what's going on in areas A and areas B, which are those small Palestinian areas, small built-up Palestinian areas within the West Bank. And in the Gaza Strip, it's entirely been reduced to just a humanitarian crisis, no longer even a political issue any longer. So the green line is very much a myth, and it's turned out to be the tool that assists both Israel in covering up what it's doing inside Israel, and it assists the donors in only focusing on a very small portion of Palestinian society, while at the same time ensuring that the donors really don't push back when it comes to things like Israel's actions in not just in East Jerusalem, but in the entirety of Jerusalem. So it's become a liability more than it has been an asset, at least for people who are trying to articulate freedom for Palestinians.
Yeah, and just perhaps to add on to that, I mean, I think the Green Line would have been an asset had the international community sort of provided any tangible results, have been able to guarantee, Palestinian rights within the Green Line. But what we've seen over the years, and last week was just a prime example of this, is that it doesn't mean anything, as you said. The US Embassy move to no man's land, which is deemed occupied land by many international organizations. The fact that the US Embassy moved there means that it's recognizing Israeli sovereignty over the entire of Jerusalem. And now the fact that there will be international diplomats from around the world going to the US Embassy and attending functions at the US Embassy also legitimizes that. And I think it's something that perhaps we have to think about, and we have to perhaps we need to focus on the EU, because I think that's the only place really we have left, or we have some, I mean, it's a shrinking space, but the only space that we have left. We have to demand that EU states do not go to the US Embassy. We've seen that already has confirmed that they will be meeting the US Embassy, the new US Embassy, and a number of Eastern European states as well have followed suit. So I think this is something definitely that a conversation that Palestinians need to be makers and leadership. What do we do with the Green Line now? Now that the Oslo peace process is dead, and that does not look like it can be revived. What do we do with the Green Line now? And I think that's something that the leadership should perhaps be engaging in, and definitely something that Palestinian civil society needs to talk about as a collective, because we are held hostage to the donors. And if it's not good enough if one organization and one group sort of stands up to the donors, it needs to be a sort of a collective action. So there's plenty of other questions here, and I'm aware that we don't have a lot of time, but perhaps I'm just going to scroll. So there was one question by someone called Roger. He says that given the word apartheid can be quite emotive in political debate, might the Palestinian cause be better served by focusing attention more on the way discriminatory legislation is used across Israel-controlled territory without using the term apartheid, especially given that it is the constraints caused by the legislation which have made the Palestinians dependent upon international aid programs? Yeah, so maybe just I'll address the first part of that question. I think all words are emotive, and I don't see sort of any problem in using emotive words. I mean, quite to the contrary, especially in advocacy work. It's very important that we use that words that, I have a problem with that word emotive. I think all words create some kind of emotion in someone. And I think apartheid, because of its links to South Africa, people can sort of make that link, that historical link. If they don't know about anything that's going on in Palestine and Israel, and you say that it's a system of apartheid, they can think, okay, I've heard of apartheid before. So actually, quite to the contrary, I think because it is such an emotive word, I think that's how it can be so beneficial to the Palestinian struggle, because people can sort of put two and two together and make that comparison. I think we have to be very careful not to accuse Palestinians or their allies of being a motive for political debate, because at the end of the day, this is lived experience, and it's real life for Palestinians. So they're not robots. This is not something that you can sort of detach emotion from. Diana, do you have anything to add to that?
Couldn't have said it any better.
Okay, great. So let's move on to perhaps, there were some questions about, this one has quite a few votes, although it's not directly linked to apartheid. The question is about Palestinian resistance. And this is from John. He says, is Palestinian resistance fit for purpose? We await a well thought out strategy of non-violent resistance from Palestinians on the ground in Palestine, along the lines of all the other classical non-violent approaches in asymmetric conflicts over the last 100 years. I don't see any signs of such proposal. Less talking, less analysis, and more actions. Any suggestions? Diana, do you have any suggestions for John?
You know, I don't know where to begin with this one, other than to say, this has been 70 years of nonviolent resistance. The fact that Palestinians still wake up every day, are still not willing to go away. They're willing, you know, Israel puts up a checkpoint, Palestinians still cross through it. Israel institutes these discriminatory laws. We find ways to try to resist them. Israel does, you know, any form of, whether it's the militarization, the land theft, the takeover of houses, any number of things on any given day. The fact that Palestinians aren't just lying down and either leaving, which is what Israel wants us to do, or continuing, you know, just saying, okay, it's all yours and go ahead with it, is indicative of the level of resistance and nonviolent resistance. The big problem is that people are looking for, they're looking for a type of resistance that they understand. And the type of resistance that they understand is if we resist non-violently, as we saw in Gaza, then we are blamed for going to demonstrations. If Palestinians resist through any violent means, again, once again, blamed. I think that the big problem is that we should stop looking for this perfect form of resistance that people can understand, and instead start looking at what Israel's doing and asking why it is that Palestinians must continue to resist, and putting blame squarely where it needs to be put blame. This isn't, John, to go after you, but it is to say that what we need to do is shift focus to what Israel is doing and demand that Israel stop, rather than demand that Palestinians have the perfect response that the rest of the world can buy into. As somebody who has lived here for quite some time, I wasn't born here, I wasn't raised here, I came here as an adult. I still do not understand how Palestinians go on. Palestinians who were born and raised here and this has been their only existence, I do not know how they continue to go on, because the entire system of apartheid here is not only infuriating, it is entirely designed to humiliate, demean, and most importantly, to dehumanize Palestinians. That's the whole effort of it, is to turn us into people that become completely dispensable. And for Israel, in terms of what it's doing against Palestinians in Gaza, that effort seems to be working. They've gotten to a point where they've dehumanized Palestinians in Gaza to such a point that they can literally gun them down without a whole lot of international condemnation for literally erecting dirt mounds to then shoot down and gun them down. And so I think that we have to instead start shifting our focus away from this perfect form of resistance, because I actually think staying alive is a perfect form of resistance, to instead focusing on what Israel is doing and making sure that Israel's held accountable for all of the actions that it has continued to carry out for 70 years.
Yeah, great. Thanks for that answer, Diana. I mean, for me, I think, you know, there's been 70 years of nonviolent resistance to the state of Israel, and there are plenty of examples, and far too many to go into in this short time. But you know, we saw Land Day in 1976. We'd seen many demonstrations, student demonstrations. The very fact that Palestinians continue to live in such dire conditions over the last 70 years as a form of resistance. And perhaps something that should be mentioned here is, you know, one of the biggest and most successful forms of Palestinian resistance has been the BDS movement. And yet the BDS movement has been criminalized and demonized by so much of the international community. And this here, you know, here is a form of resistance. It's a form of resistance that is achieving tangible results, and the international community certainly at the sort of higher levels, not the people as such, but the sort of high politics have rejected it. So it's very difficult when we're faced with this question, because, you know, people come to us and say, you know, what about nonviolent resistance, nonviolent resistance? And there are plenty of Palestinian examples of this, but they're always rejected. Or, you know, we're told you must engage in nonviolent resistance, but not that kind of nonviolent resistance. You must engage in this kind of nonviolent resistance. So I really think that when, you know, questions like this are answered, there has to be a sort of perhaps a deeper understanding of the Palestinian people and their struggle. And just finally, as a point, of course, what we saw in Gaza in the last few weeks and what we've seen in Gaza for many years has been, you know, protests, and this latest series of protests have been under the Great March of Return, and they were met with brute violence, and we saw a really horrific slaughter on Monday. So I think there is plenty of action on the ground. I don't think it's fair to say that there isn't. I just think that it doesn't fit within certain molds or frames of international understanding, and so perhaps it's not the Palestinians that have to fit their struggle within an international understanding. Perhaps it's the international community that needs to fit their understanding around the Palestinians and sort of recenter Palestinians when they look at the situation. I'm very aware of the time, so I think that was the last question. Perhaps I can put Diana just on the spot, as we have a few minutes left. Perhaps we can just do a very quick summary or sum up of the pros of the apartheid analysis in the struggle.
Okay, I think the number one pro is that it may, or not number one, the few pros. First is that it gets us back to basics, which is looking at Palestinians as a whole, as a people, as an entire population, not just these little fragments of it. Second is that it criminalizes the entire regime and not just elements of it. And third, and I think this is very important, is that it does the link between apartheid and BDS. Now, it's not obviously without its problems. There are some cons that we had a couple of questions on, but I think overall, the use of this framework is quite important to be able to get past the current system of somehow pretending that the Green Line is sacred, that somehow there is going to be a two-state settlement, which there isn't, which I don't see that there is going to be, and I think it also helps us to really build upon other struggles that have happened in the past and be able to build upon those struggles and move forward.
Great, thank you so much. And thanks to all of you who are watching live. I know it's quite a late one for some of you. We hope to be having a lot more of these policy labs, so keep your eyes peeled. We'll be advertising them when and as they happen. If you would like to receive information about our publications, about our events, please join our mailing list, which you can do so on our website. And if you'd like to, and there's actually a button as well on this Crowdcast where you can sign up to the mailing list. And if you like our work at Al-Shabaka, please consider donating. It's a very important platform for Palestinian voices, and which are much needed, because as we've mentioned before, we're often excluded from discussions about Palestine. So please donate and follow us on all our social media platforms. And thank you, Diana, for joining me this evening.
Thanks, Yara.
Ramadan Kareem, and good night.
Thank you. Bye-bye.